Hello, today is Thursday, July 1st, 2021. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. On today's podcast, we're going to take a look at best practices for wide area network SLAs, service levels, and the steps enterprises will want to take to address their service level needs. Now, we're going to focus on the key service levels for various WAN or transport services and help you define service levels that are combined with service credits to back up these service level metrics. We'll also highlight some of the gotchas and issues concerning carriers' attempts to weaken their service levels. Now, a guy who knows a lot about service levels is my colleague and good friend, David Lee, who is TC2's technical director. Hey, David, thanks for joining me.
Joe, it's great to be here today. Thank you.
Okay, so David, SLAs are a big deal. So can you please explain what WAN service levels are meant to deliver to the enterprise? And just as important, maybe you can tell us how companies actually implement these service levels that they develop.
Yes, that's right, Joe. I will review today what is a service level agreement, or SLA, and what should be included in a service level. We will then discuss the relevance of the service levels and credits and their priority and how to properly structure the service credits to encourage the right supplier behavior. And finally, what service levels should not be, what should not be included, and as you mentioned before, how carriers weaken the service levels.
Yeah, we've definitely seen firsthand why SLAs are so important with our clients and with their vendors. A lot of organizations, frankly, they depend on SLAs. David, what is the first thing that enterprises need to do?
The first thing, Joe, is to understand and define the type of the wide area network transport service. We're going to cover the transport versus managed services today, and the components that constitute the services and the supplier, in this case carrier's demarcation of those services relative to the overall enterprise infrastructure and transport services. For example, with a Teams EV deployment that includes SIP trunking service, there may be cloud-based services such as SBC as a service provided by your supplier that absolutely needs to have extreme uptime and availability, excellent performance, the move, add, change service level commitments, etc. The key point is to ensure all services in this example are covered end to end and that the supplier and enterprise clearly understand who is accountable for the service between two different service demarcs as it moves along, as the packet and bits move along the chain of connections. Finally, what's important at a high level is to ensure you include process improvement in your overall SLA or service level agreement structure, as the deal is not static. You want to make sure you keep up with the marketplace and your users' demands.
So what's the composition of service levels?
Joe, generally speaking, overall service levels are comprised of four distinct elements. Firstly, how supplier performance is measured and validated, the metrics and minimum metric or threshold requirements for that metric, the remedies should the supplier fail in meeting that service level, and then finally, what are the conditions and possible exclusions surrounding the service level. For the first area, that is how the service level is measured and validated, while there's not enough time in this podcast to cover every applicable service level, I'll provide some examples of what I'm talking about. For example, a service level for ability and the definition of outage. We'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of the gotchas associated with that point about outage. Quality and degradation of data. For example, performance metrics such as jitter, data delivery ratio, and latency. If you're talking about voice, quality of the voice transmission, that would be applicable to a SIP trunking service. For example, an R factor or mean opinion score metric, service level, jitter, data delivery ratio, and latency also are involved. So again, depending on the type of application or traffic, one may have different service levels and metrics. Installation and provisioning of those services we just talked about. Examples include installation intervals by country, by service, and related provisioning interval commitments for changes to the bandwidth for port, class of service, and related configuration changes.
So going back to that second point in your list there, how about if you give some examples for the metrics and minimum requirements?
Sure, Joe. One of the first activities to perform as part of defining the metric and the minimum threshold requirements is to specify the data sources for the metric. So let's just talk about first things first. Who is going to measure it and what tool will they use to measure it and the source of that data? Measurement methodology, for instance, frequency and sampling. Is it 1 minute polling, 5 minute, the details around that, and data retention periods. For example, data retention is important for trending the service levels over time, typically over the past 12 months or 24 months, right? Let's take a more detailed examination of the availability service level as a specific example. Key for this service level is how this metric and service level is defined for absolute outage versus degradation. For example, reference a well-established standard such as an ANSI standard, right? American National Standards Institute, or something like T1.231 as an example. Enterprise also needs to confirm what service components are included and where are those demarcations for that availability service level. Specify how it is measured. Outage time ought to be measured from the point where either the supplier or the customer first detects the outage.
There must be some questions that need to be asked. I mean, I just cannot imagine any vendor just agreeing to what an enterprise wants.
You are correct, Joe. That's an absolutely correct statement. For this availability service level, back to that example, the key questions and ambiguous gotchas from the provider will be, what is the definition of an outage and what is usable and who determines it? The carrier, for example, may not capture the concept of degraded performance, but only complete loss of use. You can hear that or see that term of art in their service level agreement. How is that service availability measured? What are the conditions? Says who is responsible for monitoring and measuring the outage for all the service components? What is the service credit? And here's an example. What is the part of or is the local access included in the measurement? Or are there any exclusions such as outages not cared for during certain days of the week or certain hours of the day? This would be an exclusion the provider may impose for certain non-US countries as an example. So all those examples have to be looked at just for that availability service level. Another example for latency or round trip delay service level, it is the time to take a packet to travel a round trip between two predefined endpoints. But it's important to know the endpoints of the measurement, the service demarcations as discussed previously. Some carriers define the measurement as an average across, say, the US from their MPLS or internet backbone node to a P router, and it's just an average. So between, say, Chicago and Minneapolis is one of the measurement points. That's a short distance. As an example, this does not truly, of course, represent what your end users experience when they have round trip delay from a data center or from a hosting center to their location, which would entail maybe thousands of miles. And that's all they care about, not some hypothetical average in a carrier backbone. They care about the end to end. Another example, while carriers weaken their service levels, is when they average the measurements of these performances over multiple network connections as opposed to measuring it on the specific connection that you're interested in from your end user's point of view.
Okay, so David, what about remedies and service credit for failure to meet these service levels?
Right, Joe. There are a number of methods to provide a structure for credits and remedies should the carrier miss the specified service credit. As we know, an enterprise pays the provider 100% every month for a service provided. But what happens if you don't receive 100% of the service, whether it's an outage or a performance issue? Service credits provide the best method to provide motivation to the carrier to provide at or above your expectations. And these service credits are usually expressed as a percentage of the monthly recurring charge or as a fixed value amount where a percentage does not make sense. Note that credit amounts should vary based on the severity of the service level failure. So that's what we call a progressive service level. So if there's short outage on a single connection, that's one percentage, such as 10%, 15%. They have an outage for a longer duration, right? 100% of the monthly recurring charge should be the service credit as an example. And there tends to be an inverse relationship between credit amounts and service level stringency. There can be also what we call above run rate, above the MRC service level credits. By that, I mean a service credit that's higher than that charge and measured in some way. If there's critical services, connections that an enterprise needs to make sure that these service credit behavior modification amounts really direct and drive their behavior and performance. And enterprise also needs additional remedies beyond credits, as many contracts fail to address, for example, chronic outages or persistent performance problems. Remedies such as expedited escalation, get well plans, increased credits, root cause analysis, and right to terminate if all else fails.
Okay, thanks, David. Good stuff. Now, if you're taking a closer look at your company's SLA requirements and you'd like to discuss it with David, me, or any of our colleagues at LB3 and TC2, please drop us an email or give us a call. You can also stay up to date by subscribing to these Staying Connected podcasts, by checking out our websites, and by following us on LinkedIn.